As Javier says, he was talking about how to use Gaussian processes to optimize a black box function. And I'm going to introduce a class of methods called approximate Bayesian computation, or ABC methods. Okay? And then Michael, afterwards, is going to talk about some exciting recent work about putting these two ideas together, so Bayesian optimization and ABC. So just out of interest, who here's heard of ABC before? Okay, it increases all the time, that's great. Okay, so I'll explain what it is and explain what it's used for and just give some basics, and then Michael will bring you up to date in more current research. Okay. So just to set the scene a little bit, what is UQ, or what is uncertainty quantification? What we're interested in? Well, as I guess many of the speakers have been saying, scientists are increasingly moving away from physical experiments towards in silico experiments, or computer experiments. Okay? So perhaps instead of doing a physical experiment, something they write a computer model of some physical situation, and then experiment on their computer. Okay? So if you think about climate science, we're potentially thinking about reorganizing the world's economy on the basis of predictions made from these computer models. Okay? And statistics really is only just starting to catch up. The past decade or two, there's been lots of research into how we should quantify uncertainties and how we should do statistics in these complex models. Okay? So the key question really is, how do we make inference about the world from a simulation of it? We know that playing around with your model is not the same thing as playing with the real world. Okay? So how do we make that leap from playing with our models to saying something meaningful about the world? So the key kind of questions are things like, how do we relate simulators to reality? How do we estimate tunable parameters, and how do we deal with things like computational constraints? If we've got a finite amount of computer power, how can we do all the analysis that we want to do? So Jeremy talked on Monday about using emulators or surrogate models for when you have a complex deterministic computer model, okay, and how you can use that to kind of save on cost and analyze your model. And I think Ian and Yanis will talk more about it as well this afternoon. At that point this afternoon, we've got parallel lab sessions. I'm going to show you the program, so we've got two options for people this afternoon. So one option is to do GPy-opt, which is carrying on with the Python and doing GPy, okay, so doing Bayesian optimization. Next door, we'll also have a parallel session where Ian and Yanis will be looking at history matching, right? So more kind of worked examples, but in R, so a different language. Okay? So you can take your pick this afternoon, whether you stay here and do GPy-opt, doing Bayesian optimization, or go next door if you're more interested in kind of parameter estimation type things, but that is using R. Okay. So the problem I'm going to focus on is the calibration problem. So just to set up the notation, okay, we're going to think about some parameters that we want to learn. Theta, okay, they might include initial conditions, things of interest, okay? And we're going to suppose we've got some simulator, f of theta, which is going to generate some output x. And so we're interested in the inverse problem. So suppose we're given observable data, d. Okay? We want to go backwards and say, what was theta? What parameters led to this data? Okay? So this is the example from my PhD. Okay? So we've got a model of evolution. So these are the primates evolving through time. Okay? So we've got a model that specifies things like when was the first primate, when was the divergence time from other mammals, and how quickly did they diversify, and so on. And then we've got data on modern primates, monkeys and so on. And then we've got fossils, and the challenge is to go backwards, okay, to solve the inverse problem, to say what theta could have led to this data d. Okay. And for Bayesians, of course, this is just a question of finding the posterior. So what we're going to be trying to find is the posterior distribution of theta given our data d. And on paper, of course, that looks very simple. It's just the prior for theta times the likelihood function for the data. So I guess there's the whole of statistics is concerned with how we do this. Okay? And for classical statistical models, things like Gaussians and Poissons and binomials, we know how to do this using MCMC or all kind of methods. Okay? It becomes more complicated when we've got a complex model. Okay? if it doesn't fit into that nice framework we have where everything's Gaussian or Poisson or nice kind of parametric forms that we're used to dealing with, life becomes very hard solving this inverse problem. And really there's kind of been two main schools for doing this. So if you've got a complex, deterministic, expensive model, then the main approach has been using Gaussian process emulators or surrogate models like Jeremy was talking about. And then independently, there's been a separate stream of research that's been looking at if you've got stochastic, very cheap, but still complex models. Okay? So models where you can maybe run it a few times a second, or maybe a few hundred times a second, but it still doesn't fit into that nice framework that we're used to that allows us to use MCMC. And that's where ABC is useful. Okay? And in the past few years, they've come back together again and kind of borrowed from each other. So why is this problem hard? What's hard about Bayesian inference? Well, all we want to do is find its posterior, which is prior times likelihood, okay, divided by some normalizing constant. So the usual reason we say this is difficult is because we don't know this normalizing constant here. We don't know the evidence or the partition function. So in the 80s, people figured out how to solve this using Gibbs sampling or Metropolis Hastings, okay, and we figured out how to do this when we didn't know the denominator here. But the problem can get harder. So there's a class of problems that are called doubly intractable, and that's where we don't know the likelihood function except up to a normalizing constant. So the likelihood function itself is unknown, but we know what it's proportional to. So people like Ian Murray and Zubin Garamani and Dave Mackay and others have worked on what are called doubly intractable methods, where we kind of know what the shape of this, but we're missing a constant that depends upon the parameter. What ABC is useful for is what we're calling completely intractable problems, okay, where we know nothing about the shape of this likelihood function. Okay? So all we know is the prior. We can write down that, evaluate that, but we don't know what the likelihood function looks like. So if we don't know that, it's really hard to do anything other than sample from the model. So we're going to make the assumption that we can generate samples from this model, okay, but we're going to assume that we don't know how to evaluate the density in any way. Okay? And so this class of kind of completely intractable models where we have to resort to ABC methods. Okay. So what are ABC? I prefer the label ABC to approximate Bayesian computation because there are, of course, lots of approximate Bayesian computation algorithms. Okay? But ABC refers to a particular class of them. Okay? So ABC algorithms are essentially a class of Monte Carlo methods where we use simulation rather than evaluating the likelihood function itself. So we don't need to be able to work out the value of this likelihood function, we just need to do simulation from it. So we're going to be doing lots and lots of forward simulation. And for that reason, because they don't use the likelihood function, they're sometimes called likelihood-free methods. But as Neil's fond of pointing out, there is a likelihood function, we just don't know how to evaluate it. Yep. So I think this is a misnomer, likelihood-free. That's why I prefer the label ABC here. Okay, and the first ABC paper, well, there's lots of candidates. This 1997 paper or the 2002 paper often given as the first kind of ABC paper. So it's quite a recent kind of development, but since then it's really taken off. Okay? So there are now thousands and thousands of scientific papers based upon using ABC. And they're mainly in areas like genetics, epidemiology, ecology, and so on. And so the reason they become popular is partly because they're just so damn simple. Okay? Pretty much you can always do an ABC, implement an ABC algorithm to do inference in your model. They're also very intuitive, so you'll see what the most basic form of the algorithm is in a minute. Okay? It feels like a natural thing to be doing. Okay? And they're also kind of embarrassingly parallelizable. Okay? So if you're a biological lab, a biology lab, you might not be very good at statistics and doing MCMC and working out how to do Gibbs sampling and so on, but you can probably simulate from your model. Okay? And because ABC is so simple, and you've probably got a supercomputer somewhere, okay, you can just throw your simulation at the supercomputer and do inference that way, and train your model in that way. Okay. So what is the most basic form of ABC? Well, it's based on the rejection algorithm. So if you took any courses in statistics, you've probably seen the rejection algorithm at some point. Okay? So remember, what we're trying to do here is sample from the posterior of theta given the data d. Well, the rejection algorithm says pick a value of theta from the prior distribution, and then accept theta with probability proportional to the likelihood function. Okay. So if we do this over and over and keep doing this until we get enough accepted values of theta, it's easy to show that we will get accepted values from the posterior. And they're independent. So that works great when it works. Okay. But what's the problem with it? Well, the problem is we don't know the likelihood function. Okay, so we can't do this. So we're going to try and modify this into an algorithm that we can use. Okay, so there's a kind of a mechanical version of this, which I kind of like to think of as a mechanical version of Bayes' theorem, in a sense. Okay. So the mechanical version of this says draw a value of theta from your prior, simulate from your model, so put theta into your model, get a random draw from it, okay, x, and then you're going to accept theta now if d exactly matches x. Yep, so if your simulation matches your data. And again, you can see what's the probability we're going to accept. Well, the probability we're going to accept here is just the likelihood. Yep. So what we've done is taken this rejection algorithm where we needed to know the likelihood function to one where we just need to be able to simulate. Okay. So this is exact as well. Okay. This, all acceptances here, will give us draws from the posterior distribution of theta given the data d. Okay. Yeah?
So the model with, say, a lot of dependence assumptions, my likelihood is usually going to be very, very small, right? So I'm not going to accept anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So in practice, this isn't going to work either. Okay, if your data are continuous, high dimensional, complex, in any shape, this is never going to work. Okay? So this is kind of exact, Monte Carlo exact. Okay? So to get an ABC algorithm, we approximate. Okay? So now we're going to pick a parameter from our prior, simulate from our model again, and now we're going to accept if the distance between the data and our simulated output is small. Okay? Where we're going to measure distance in some way we like. Okay? So I've got some distance function rho here, and I'm going to say except if it's small enough. Okay? And we can talk about what small enough might mean later. Okay? We've got some tolerance, epsilon, some distance function, and we're just going to accept if we're close according to whatever definition we choose to pick of close. Okay. So to understand what this is doing here, we can kind of think about what happens in the two limiting cases as epsilon goes small or large. Okay? So if epsilon goes to infinity here, we're going to pick from the prior, simulate, and always accept. Yep. And so we're just going to get the prior back again. Yep. So in the case where epsilon's infinity, we just get the prior. Okay? But it's very cheap. Yeah? To get 1,000 acceptances, we need to do 1,000 simulations, but we've learned nothing. If epsilon's 0 here, and rho's a metric, okay, then it says accept theta only if d matches x, and we're back to the previous slide. Okay? And we know we're exact again, okay, so we exactly get the posterior, but it's too expensive. We're never going to be able to do it. We're never going to get matches. Okay. So epsilon kind of reflects this tension between computability and accuracy. Large epsilon is very cheap. Okay. We don't need to do too much computation, but very inaccurate. Small epsilon is very expensive to get enough simulation, but it is more accurate. Okay, so in pictures, what's happening here? This is a completely toy example. I've made it up. We've got a parameter theta that goes from -10 to 10. Okay. And I've just made up some complex likelihood function. It's not complex, okay, but let's just suppose it is. I've got some quadratic dependence for a mean. Okay. Then I've got cubic dependence for the mean, quadratic for the variance, and we've just got a Gaussian thing. Okay. So what does ABC say? It says pick a value of theta from the prior. So pick the value from -10 to 10, and then do a simulation from this model. So I've picked a theta, done the simulation, and I've plotted it here. Okay. Done that many, many times. What ABC says is you find the value of your data, so I've said D2 here, so I've drawn a line through D equals 2, and accept any points that are close to the data. Okay. So all I've done here is put a line through the data and coloured any points that are close in red. Okay. So they're all the points we're going to accept, and they're good points because they're close to our data. Okay. Where close here is defined by this metric. And I've got epsilon to be 10 here. So anything that's within a distance 10 of the data, we're going to keep. So what we do then, we take all the red points and draw a histogram. So that's the red line here. And so that is our estimate of the posterior, this red histogram. And for reference, I've just put what the true posterior is here. Okay. So you can see we've learned quite a lot. we started thinking it was from -10 to 10. Okay? We now know the posterior lies between -3 and 3, but we're not resolving any of these details. Okay? We just learned that it's kind of in this range. But as we decrease epsilon, we start to learn a bit more. So if epsilon 7.5, we start to cut out some of the bits down here, and we start to resolve some of these peaks. Okay? So epsilon 5, obviously it gets more expensive to do this because we have fewer acceptances in here. Okay? So we've now resolved that. We know it can't be, take a value about 1. We know that's not plausible in our posterior. And so on. Okay? So by the time we get down to epsilon is 1, we've got quite a narrow slice through our picture here, and we've got a posterior that looks quite a lot like the true posterior. So our ABC posterior is quite close to the truth here. And this is quite a nice way of thinking what Bayes' theorem says. Okay, so Bayes' theorem is an infinitesimally thin slice through here. And that's just what Bayes' theorem is doing. If you're able to take this, no thickness at all, you get the true posterior. Okay? That's where the black line comes from. But with an ABC tolerance of 1, okay, we're doing okay. Yeah, we've learnt, we'd be pretty happy with that as our estimate of the posterior. Okay. So in practice, of course, we're rarely in this kind of nice 1D case where we've got a 1D output and a 1D input. Okay. So in practice, life's more complicated. So often we have high-dimensional outputs. So one of the things that is often done is to describe a summary statistic. Okay, so there's some way of summarizing your data, and then accepting theta if the distance between the summary of your data and the summary of your simulator output is small. Okay? So maybe you take the mean, variance, whatever. You take a number of summaries of your output, and you're going to accept if they're small. And if S is a sufficient statistic here, this is kind of equivalent to what we were doing before. Okay? But of course, in practice, sufficiency depends upon the likelihood function, so we never know if you've got a sufficient statistic or not. Okay. So that's kind of a basic intro to ABC. As you can see, this is incredibly simple to implement, right? If you can simulate from your model, anyone can write code to do this without the help of a statistician straight away. Okay? And so because it's so simple, it's become popular, and so it's important we try to understand these methods and try to improve them. Okay, we're a bit behind. So to understand what ABC is doing, okay, we can try to think about what problem we're actually solving. Okay. So this is the inverse problem we started wanting to solve. Okay, so we wanted to solve that the data D is the output of our simulator. Okay, we wanted to find theta for which this is true. But it's easy to show that instead we're solving this inverse problem. Okay? So we're actually solving the case where we've got a model that it says the data D is a simulator output plus an error term, okay, where the distribution of the error term depends upon the assumptions we make for ABC. Okay? So in the setup we had before, where we had just this L1 norm for the distance matrix, okay, that's equivalent to assuming uniform error on this error term. So we can understand, we can interpret what the output from ABC means. Okay? So if we go back to one of these pictures, okay, this is the posterior we would get if we then said that D was X plus a uniform error with on the interval -10 to 10. Okay. So, Michael, did you need me to talk about generalized ABC, different kernels? Not necessarily. Okay. I'll skip that then. Okay. So what are the key challenges for ABC? Well, the key challenges are how to control tolerance, how to make it small. Okay? We know that the smaller epsilon is, okay, the smaller the error is. So a lot of the effort has gone into trying to find algorithms that allow us to take the tolerance smaller and smaller and smaller so we get more accurate results. The other key challenge is how do we find good summary statistics? Okay? If your data, the output of your model, are gene expression data, for example, so thousands, millions of data points, okay, we want to find a low-dimensional summary of that that is informative about the parameters. How do we find good summaries? Okay. Okay. So first of all, efficient algorithms. This is kind of where the first wave of effort in ABC went after the first after statisticians first started noticing it. So all the Monte Carlo crowd, like Pierre Del Moral and Arnaud Doucet and Christophe Andrew and so on, started thinking about how we could ABCify other algorithms. Okay? So the rejection algorithm I put up before is very inefficient. As it said, pick a theta from the prior, do a simulation, accept or reject. Okay? So keep picking from the prior is very inefficient because we're not learning. Okay? If your parameter is, say, 10-dimensional, your prior space might be quite large, okay? And where your posterior might be in a small corner of that space. So what do we do in standard Bayesian inference? Well, we do things like Markov chain Monte Carlo or sequential Monte Carlo to try and narrow that space down. Okay? So there's a lot of early effort in adapting existing Monte Carlo algorithms to be ABC versions of them, okay? So approximate versions of them. So we had approximate MCMC, approximate SMC, approximate EM, approximate EP, and so on. Okay? And the entire aim is to make the algorithms more efficient so that we can spend more time doing simulation in good regions of space. So just to illustrate one of them, one of these methods, and why it's difficult, let's just think about MCMC. So I assume most people are familiar with MCMC. Okay? But the key challenge with MCMC is to try and think of good proposals. Okay? So good ways to move around the parameter space. So it turns out that when we do ABC, we're targeting a posterior that is a function of theta and x, okay? And that just consists of the prior, the unknown likelihood term, okay, and some ABC rejection part, which I've not really talked about. So that would be an indicator function, okay, in general. We're targeting something like this. The details aren't important here. Okay? The key thing is we've got this likelihood function in the thing we want to target. Okay? So when we write down the Metropolis-Hastings acceptance ratio, whatever we use for Q, okay, we need Q to make sure, and when we've got the ratio of the posterior we're targeting, okay, we need this term to cancel because we can't evaluate this. Okay. So consequently, we've kind of been forced into this awkward situation where our proposal, our Metropolis-Hastings proposal, has to involve a simulation step from the model. So we're always forced to be in a situation where we propose some move in theta, and then we do some more simulation with a new theta. Okay? So it says, pick a new theta, pick theta prime, and then at theta prime, pick a new x prime from the model. Because okay? If we do that, when we write out all these expressions in here, we find that the likelihood that comes from the posterior term and the likelihood in the proposal cancel out, okay? And it leaves us with something that we can calculate. Okay? So consequently, you know, all of the adaptations of existing Monte Carlo methods, so MCMC, ABC, and sequential Monte Carlo, that they're still inefficient in the sense that they have to keep repeatedly simulating from this model time and time again, because in order to make the calculations work, the kind of fine likelihood calculations we need, so in this case, the Metropolis-Hastings ratio, okay, we have to have this likelihood term cancel out. And because of that, they're inefficient. So, let me skip that. One of the things that Michael's going to talk about, okay, and asked me to introduce, is a related algorithm published in Nature by Simon Wood. Okay? So Simon Wood's a statistician in Reading, and he had this single author stats paper in Nature where he essentially reinvented ABC without having heard of ABC, but it's slightly different. Okay? So he had this synthetic likelihood method that turns out to be very closely related to ABC, but works better in some situations. So I am going to talk about the generalized bit. Apologies for skipping back and forth here. Okay? We talked about how here, when we, in ABC, we wanted to solve this inverse problem, but we're really solving this inverse problem, where if we were doing what we were doing before, where we were accepting with a metric like this, we had a uniform error here. It's possible to generalize this, so instead of having a uniform error distribution for this error term, we can make the error term whatever distribution we like. So if we change our ABC algorithm to say, pick theta from the prior, simulate x from the model, okay, and now we're going to accept theta and x with a probability that's related to some new term, and this is going to be an arbitrary acceptance term. So given an x, we've got some term that gives us a probability for the data d. Okay, and we could have this whatever we like. It could be Gaussian, anything you like. Okay, just a weighting function. If we take it to be 0 or 1, okay, so 1 if the distance between x and d is small and 0 otherwise, okay, so this is an indicator function, we get exactly back to what we had before. Okay. So this step here reduces to accept theta if and only if the distance between d and x is small. But by doing this, by writing the acceptance, a general acceptance term here, okay, we can control the distribution of this error term and make it anything we like. Okay? So we can make it Gaussian or whatever we please, or whatever makes sense for our model. Okay, so back to synthetic likelihood. I apologize I'm skipping around. I've tried to condense a longer tutorial into 35 minutes. So the synthetic likelihood, okay, instead of using a Gaussian acceptance kernel here, so for example, if we let this acceptance term be Gaussian, okay, so we just said that the error on our simulator output is Gaussian, okay, so that would be our ABC thing. Instead of doing that, maybe we take our parameter value theta and run the simulator multiple times at theta, generating multiple outputs, okay, and then let's find the mean of all those outputs, the covariance matrix of those outputs, and assume that the likelihood function is Gaussian. Okay. So it's closely related, but it's different. But it's still an ABC type of thing because we're not using the true likelihood, we're using kind of a fake ABC type likelihood. Okay. So it allows us to think about, write down a likelihood function that depends upon simulator output only. And for each new theta, we re-estimate the mean and covariance matrix to get a new summary. Okay. Javier, what the? Coffee breaks at 1:30, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely.
Okay, that's okay. No. I'm going to. Okay. So what I'll do, I think, is introduce what happens if we have expensive simulators, okay, and think about the problems to come. So I had a nice simulation to show, but I can't. It's on my laptop, unfortunately. So ABC requires us to do a vast amount of simulation. Okay? So typically, we're going to simulate from the model, order of millions of times, okay, to do inference. Yep. So you've got to be able to run your simulator millions, tens of millions of times. Okay? So typically, people take their biological model, throw it off on their high-performance computing facility, okay, the genetic model or whatever it is, okay, wait a week with it running on 100 cores, okay, and come back and get their posterior. Okay. For complex models, for truly expensive models, we can't do that. Okay. So as a model I've been working on, it's a model of cancer evolution in colons. Okay. So we have a number of stem cells, okay, and each of them produces a pattern of colon cells, okay, and that's something we can measure in patients. And they want to infer the number of stem cells in each patient, because that's important in diagnosis of cancer and treating cancer. Okay. But each simulation here is an MCMC run. Okay. It's just a Markov chain. Okay. And each run takes about an hour, and it's highly stochastic. Okay. So run the model 10 times, you get 10 completely different looking outputs. Okay. And so we can't directly use ABC. It takes an hour each time, so we can't do millions of simulations. We can't directly use emulators either because the output is stochastic. Okay. So a straightforward application of Gaussian processes isn't going to work so far here. And all the tricks and bells and whistles that have been developed in ABC aren't going to work either because you can make your algorithm as efficient as you like. But if you're still limited to an hour per simulation, you're still limited to order of thousands of simulator runs. So what can we do instead? Okay, well, Jeremy briefly talked about the use of Gaussian processes for parameter estimation. So there's a famous paper by Kennedy and Hagen, which Were you mentioning it? Or someone was mentioning it yesterday? Okay, been mentioned by all sorts of people. Okay, so what Mark and Tony said was that if you have an expensive deterministic function, you can approximate it by a Gaussian process, okay, and then use the Gaussian process in an MCMC scheme, for example, to work out what the posterior is. Okay? That only works if you can represent your simulator as a Gaussian process. Okay? And for the kind of complex stochastic models that are used in biology, where they're switches, and so they tend to be discrete distributions, okay, multimodal and so on, a Gaussian process emulator isn't necessarily going to work. Okay. So what a lot of people are looking at in ABC recently, and this is Michael's talk, is ways of bringing Gaussian process kind of emulators, or any sort of emulator for that matter, any sort of surrogate model, to improve ABC in some way. So what can we model? So in general, we could instead think about trying to emulate the likelihood function. Okay. So if what we care about is parameter estimation, the approach of Kennedy and Hagen is wasteful. Okay. So the Kennedy and Hagen said, if this is your simulator input, this is your output, build a model of the simulator that is good everywhere in space. Okay. So for any theta, predict the output, okay, and we're going to use that in our emulator. But if all we care about is a calibration problem, we can instead focus on the likelihood function. The likelihood function is, at least in theory, a lot nicer to work with in that it's just a function of the parameter theta, okay, and it explicitly depends on the data d. So we don't need it to be good everywhere. We only need it to be good where the likelihood is large, where it matters. Okay. It's also one-dimensional, so if your output d is high-dimensional, the likelihood is still one-dimensional. Okay. So we've got around that problem needing to work with a high-dimensional surface. Okay. But the downside is it can be very tricky, as I think Michael will talk about, to get a handle on. Okay. So for ABC, for example, we don't know the likelihood, but we could try and emulate a model the synthetic likelihood. Okay. So this was the Simon Wood approach, okay, where it assumed the likelihood was Gaussian, where we estimated the mean and covariance. Okay. So there was a sequence of, this immediately kind of suggests modeling this depends on theta. Okay? So this is a paper by Mark Girolami and Patrick Conrad and others from last year. Okay? But it's saying that if the forward model exhibits regularity and it's dependent on some parameters, perhaps we can model that in some way. Okay? We can put a surrogate model in to try and reduce the number of model evaluations. So if this varies smoothly and predictably as a function of theta, okay, perhaps we can learn that with a cheaper surrogate model and try and use that in our inference instead. So there's been a sequence of papers. So I tried modeling this directly. Okay. Ted Mead and Max Welling were emulating the mean vector and the covariance matrix. Okay. Michael and Jukka Kuranda were emulating the discrepancy function. Okay. And each can work well in different situations, and other people have tried different things. Okay. But the key idea is to try and capture any smoothness that is in the assumed likelihood function and exploit that in some way to reduce the amount of simulation you need to do. Okay. How are we doing? Is coffee here?
Coffee's here.
It's here. Okay. I will. Yeah. You know, I got a bit sick to try and do this after my kids were down, so I feel wired anyway. Coffee is not what I need right now. So let's just show you what saving we can get here. Okay. So there's this Ricker model that's kind of a prototypic example that's used in Monte Carlo, and that it's hard to do inference. Okay, so it's a toy model, okay, and it's just got 3 parameters in, and it just models populations through time. Okay. But it turns out to be particularly perverse to work with. Okay, so it's just a iterative model. Okay, so we've got the number of counts of some animal, okay, that evolves through time, and there's some parameter that is some inflation factor. Okay. Then we've got a noise term that has another parameter in, and then finally we count the animals, and so we have a kind of a Poisson thinning of them, so a third parameter. Okay. So the idea is, if you're going to use a Gaussian process to do this, you could run your simulator lots of times. So these are the 3 parameters here, predicting to dimensions. Run it multiple times, okay? At each theta location, run the model a number of times and estimate the log likelihood, there, estimate the likelihood, and then we're going to fit a Gaussian process to our estimate of the likelihood. Okay? So these are just toy plots to show our prediction. Again, I've plotted the black line on, which is a noisy estimate of the truth. Okay? And we're going to try and find, narrow down the regions of space to find where it works better and iteratively build up things. Because we're doing calibration here, we don't care about regions that are really bad. Okay, so if the log likelihood is very small, if it's minus infinity, we don't care about it. We just rule it out and try and put more points in later. Okay? So this relates to the history matching idea that Ian and Yanis will talk about later. Okay, so we could go through this a few iterations, iteratively ruling out bits of space. Okay, so we could maybe after the first wave of this, we learned this region was terrible. Okay, so we could put some more points in the good region. Okay, build a new Gaussian process model, okay. And carry on in this way for a little while. Okay.
Were those Sobel sequences you were using?
They were, yeah. Okay. So at the end, what we're going to find is some small portion of space that we don't think is too terrible, okay, but where the likelihood is well enough behaved that we can hopefully model it well enough. Okay? So we're going to keep rolling out bits of space until we're down to, I've thrown out 95% of space here. We've got a small bit of space left where we think the posterior lies. Okay? We're going to fit a good model in this region using the shiniest, whizziest Gaussian process we can think of. Okay? And then we're going to do that to do the inference. So what we've got here is the estimates of the posterior using an expensive method, so the original kind of wood method, and the green line is using the Gaussian process. Okay? So they're very close, you can see, with these two parameters, but some difference here, but I actually trust my results better here. Okay? But the key point is how much work we've had to do to get here. Okay? So to get these full posteriors, the black lines, we've had to do 10 to the 5 times 500 simulations. Using an emulator, we can get away with 2 orders of magnitude fewer. Okay? So we've used 1,000 times 500 simulator runs. Okay? So about a hundredth of the number used by Simon Wood. Okay? Just by trying to learn this dependence upon theta. Okay? Instead of just relearning this every time, as in the original paper, we've just fit a Gaussian process. It doesn't matter here how we do this, whether you use Max Welling's and Ted Mead's approach and model the mean, or whether we model the discrepancy function, like Michael talked about, or whether we model likelihood directly. By introducing a surrogate model, we can make vast savings. Okay, so apologies for the rapid speed of that. Michael will talk in more detail about bringing you up to speed with more recent research, but I just wanted to introduce the concept of ABC so that you've seen it before. Okay? The key points to take away, I guess, are that, one, you can always do ABC pretty much. Okay? No matter how perverse your model is, there's some sort of ABC algorithm you can use. Okay? Secondly, if you can avoid using ABC, you should. Okay? If you can use MCMC or Gibbs sampling or whatever, you should certainly do that. Okay? Avoid it when you can. Then there's lots of algorithmic developments and so on to make it more efficient and to work with more complex models. But you can go away and read about all of them if you have cause to. Okay, so thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
A question for when you said you match what your simulator gives you with what you observe in reality, where you do this D equals X idea, especially for like climate simulations, you don't have just one number or 10 numbers, but you have like over an entire grid, you have all these quantities. So how do you actually compare these models?
So the aim is to try and summarize them both. Okay? So to find a lower dimensional projection of your data and your summaries that you think is most informative for the parameters. Okay? So I favour using scientific judgment there. Okay? So scientists with climate, for example, are very good at knowing what the informative bits are, so like sea surface temperature, surface air temperature, and so on. Okay? But lots of people have tried to automate this in many ways. So there's been a lot of work in using random forests, for example, or I've got a student visiting at the moment who's using convolutional neural nets to try and pick out features of the output, the huge output vector, okay, it might be 10 to the 6 variables or whatever, to try and find the modes of variation in that output in your simulator that are informative about the parameter. But there's no accepted way of doing this, and it's not clear to know what you're doing. In that, just because a summary is informative for your parameter doesn't mean it's actually what you want to be doing if your model wasn't designed to predict that. So that's kind of the other point made in the Simon Wood paper. That, for example, if you have a dynamical system model, perhaps all you care about is the period and amplitude of your model. You don't really care about whether it's in phase with your data. Okay? So if you have the wrong summary that isn't phase free, you can kind of get misled in that way. Okay? But generally, it's a completely open question. We do know that the dimension of the summary should roughly match the dimension of your parameter in terms of information loss. That's a good rule, because that's Fernhead and Prangle. But beyond that, we don't know a lot. Okay. Ed. No, you could use the same runs. Okay, I mean the problem for large models is saying what the likelihood function is in the first place, right? That is really, I mean, I think Ian will criticise the entire idea of trying to write down the likelihood function and say we should be doing something called history matching instead, which is very
entirety,
no. So deciding what the good likelihood function is the challenge there. But then it doesn't matter whether you try and emulate the simulator output or the likelihood function. Okay, you'll have to rebuild the emulator, of course. But you can use the same simulator runs. Yeah? So ABC, in some sense, is very much like history matching. So it lives somewhere between history matching and probabilistic calibration, as you might see later.
It's a good question. I will talk this afternoon after lunch about the choices of what to emulate and where to emulate. Because you can emulate right at the model interface, of the model output directly. That can be beneficial. Or you can emulate some summary of the model, or you can go all the way to the likelihood, as Richard is suggesting. And depending on your context, either of those might be sensible choices.
Okay, I think it's time for coffee.